Hey guys, so it's good to talk to you all after a long 2 weeks. I'm quite tired. Many of you may have noticed that I didn't really do a substantive video last week. I just did the one poem reading video, and then this Wednesday I did the skating video. Hope to do more of those skating videos. Yeah, it's been a bit of a stressful couple weeks, which is being a bit melodramatic, because really hasn't been that bad, but still, I've been very tired just with everything going on at school and stuff. But I'm really glad to be here to talk to you about the books that I finished and I'm going to read and have in progress right now as of the second half of October. So I'm going to go sort of in reverse order on these books. I'm going to start with the book that I finished most recently and work my way backwards. So the book that I just finished yesterday was God Emperor of Dune by Frank Herbert. This is the fourth book in his Dune saga. I'm supposed to be making a video about this for DuneTube, so I'm not going to go into detail on the plot. I'll talk more in that video. But to summarize my thoughts on this book in a sentence, basically, I would say that I found it interesting, and I guess I liked it. But I kind of felt like I didn't really know what was going on half the time, or 3/4 of the time. There's just so much complex scheming going on, and so many complex ideas at work, that I just feel like I couldn't quite grasp them all. I feel like maybe those will come out to me in a second reading and a reread, which I do intend to do. But yeah, I wouldn't call it my favorite so far. I definitely, just in terms of pure enjoyment, I definitely prefer the first three, but I did like it. I see myself revisiting it. So anyway, I'm glad I read it. I'll be making an entire video about it though, so keep your eyes out for that. On a completely different note, my next book is a nonfiction book, and that's sort of a common theme in this wrap-up, which is that I did sort of begin my nonfiction November reading, 2 weeks before nonfiction November began. But I don't really need an excuse to read nonfiction. I read it all the time, and I love it. So anyway, this next book is On Elizabeth Bishop by Colm Toibin. This is just a very brief study of Elizabeth Bishop's work and her life. It has a lot of analyses of Elizabeth Bishop's poems, and along the way, as Colm Toibin examines her work, he provides you with certain details of her life, and you do sort of get this overall vision of her life, even though he doesn't necessarily give you the details of what happened in every year of her life. I really liked the analyses of her poems. It sent me back to reread some of her poems and really definitely put her as a poet in a new light for me. I think I have a really new appreciation for her, and I think I'll be trying to do a deeper reading of her overall body of work in the coming months, which should be pretty easy because I do own her collected poems. There were parts that dragged a little bit. He does go on sort of excursions where he talks a bit about his own life, and that's a bit less interesting. It is still sort of interesting, but I just, it's not really why I came to the book. He also has long excursions where he talks about Robert Lowell, who was one of Elizabeth Bishop's best friends, and also Tom Gunn, who is another poet who didn't know Bishop well, but whose work was sort of similar to hers in some ways, and he talks about the sort of stylistic similarity between them. And those I found slightly less interesting because I'm just not as interested in Tom Gunn or Robert Lowell as I am in Elizabeth Bishop. But if you are a fan of Elizabeth Bishop, I think you might really enjoy this, and it's really short. You'll get through it really quickly. But I might not recommend it so much to people who aren't specifically interested in Elizabeth Bishop, but I'm glad I read it. The next book was for a read-along. It was for the Gone with the Book read-along, hosted by Mel over at Mel's Bookland Adventures. I mentioned in a previous video that I was going to be reading A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man for the Gone with the Book readathon for this month, but instead I ended up reading The Future of an Illusion by Sigmund Freud. This was published in the 1920s, and it's Sigmund Freud's main book about religion and the psychological motivations for religion. And that's kind of what drew me to it, because I'm very interested in religion, and I'm interested in Freud as well. But basically, the crux of Freud's argument is that religion, and specifically the idea of God, were invented by humans because once humans grow up out of sort of infancy and early childhood, they realize that their fathers are not as all-powerful as they seem when they're very, very young. So they sort of need something to replace the father figure, and that becomes God. And, I don't necessarily agree with that, of course. It's a very patriarchal view of the human condition. I feel like it's a very sort of condescending view of religion and very sort of infantilizing for people who are religious. But it's interesting to think about, nonetheless. Freud is one of those people who I don't really agree with, but who I like to read because he at least gets me thinking. I can definitely see a lot of the arguments of the new atheists, like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, sort of have their seed in this book. I think Freud may have been a bit more level-headed and temperate than the new atheists, but still, the ideas are certainly there. Anyway, and this book is also, on that score, a sort of critique of religion and the idea of God, and the absurdity of the idea of God, and the fact that any argument in favor of God's existence is not really tenable. So there's that as well as the psychological examination of religion. Anyway, I thought it was interesting. There are some quotes in here that I'll be adding to my commonplace book, just because he does make some perceptive comments about religion, I think. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call it a must-read. This next one was a reread for me. It's a Poetry Handbook by Mary Oliver, who is one of the two literary giants, at least for me, who have been lost this year. We lost Mary Oliver earlier this year, and then just a few weeks ago we lost Harold Bloom, unfortunately. But anyway, this is just a very, very basic introduction to the mechanisms of poetry. Rhyme, meter, what the different forms are, imagery, all these sorts of things. And it is very basic, and you can basically read it in one sitting because it's very easy to read. It was a great text for me to read when I was just getting into reading poetry. And at the time I was also writing poetry, and it was helpful in that regard too, but it was, I think, ultimately more important for me in terms of getting me to read more poems, because that's one of the big things in this book, which is that you need to read poems to write poems, and so that admonition really got me to read more poems, which is great. So anyway, if you want a very basic introduction to poetry, you might consider this. Turn now to The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. This is her memoir of the year after her husband died very suddenly of a heart condition. And it's also a memoir of her struggles as her daughter is constantly hospitalized with an illness. And it's really an extended meditation on grief and mourning. And it's just beautifully written. I loved it. I think it has so many good points about the experience of mourning, and especially powerful in this, which I think comes through, is that so many different paths of thought lead you to thinking about a loved one who you have just lost because they were so close to you, especially as Joan Didion and her husband were close. I mean, they were as close as any couple have been, but they were especially close in the sense that, they worked together every day. They were both writers. They read each other's work. They were around each other all the time, and they worked together on many projects as well. And so when you lose someone who's that close, a lot of different thinking patterns lead you to thinking about them, and to thinking about memories about them, and then that leads you to, obviously break down because of the emotions you get from thinking about that. And I thought that was particularly powerful. And what I also really loved was how Joan Didion talks about how mourning is also kind of a selfish process. She says something really interesting at one point, which I want to read to you very quickly. And she writes that we are imperfect mortal beings, aware of that mortality even as we push it away, failed by our every complication, so wired that when we mourn our losses, we also mourn, for better or for worse, ourselves, as we were, as we are no longer, as we will one day not be at all. And so the process of mourning can often be a lot about yourself and what this loss has done to you personally, in addition to, you know, feeling sad over the loss of the loved one. And that's okay. That it's okay to have that sort of selfish feeling of self-pity in the wake of such a terrible loss. And yeah, so I loved this. I thought it was great. You know, if you've heard of it, I mean, I've heard of it from everywhere. And everyone, I don't think I've ever heard someone say that they didn't like this book. So if you're someone who's heard that from many places, I'm here to tell you that it's true, that it actually is just as good as everyone says it is. So anyway, it's great. It made me very emotional, especially toward the end. So I guess that's something to keep in mind, because obviously it is dealing with a very heavy subject matter. But yeah, highly recommended. The next one is one I've already talked about, so I'm not going to go too in-depth. It's Why I Read by Wendy Lesser. Yeah, this is just a very brief meditation. It actually is short. It doesn't look that short here, but this is a large print, so that's why it looks longer. That's a very brief meditation on the love of reading, and she talks about poetry, novels, obviously, essays. She talks about translation of fiction, and she talks about plot, character, etc. And it was just a lot of fun. You know, if you like books on books, you'll like it. Moving on now to the books I have begun. I'm not that far into any of these, so I don't have all that much to say about any of them. But the first one I have here is The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, which I'm finally reading after years of meaning to read it. Steve Donahue is hosting a mandatory read-along of it, so I hope you're all participating. I certainly am, and I'm really looking forward to finally delving into this book that, you know, has had such a huge influence, and which, you know, I have experienced the ideas from this book in so many other books, that to finally come here and read the primary source is always super interesting. I'm only 25 pages in, so I don't have very many impressions yet, but I will certainly be doing a video about this when the time comes. And on a related note, the other one I've started is The Ancestor's Tale, A Pilgrimage to the Dawn of Evolution by Richard Dawkins and Yan Wong. This is a book where the authors trace human evolution in reverse. So they start with modern humans and then work back to the last common ancestor that we had with, for example, chimpanzees, and then work back from there to our next common ancestors with orangutans, and basically work all the way back through human evolution all the way to the beginning of life on Earth. And I just could not resist that premise, and it's a book that I wanted to read before the end of this year, so squeezing it in at the end here. It is a big thing, and I have a lot of books that I'm going to have to read in November, so we will see if I finish it. But I'm really liking it so far. It's really interesting. And the last book here is another memoir. This is An Unquiet Mind, a memoir of moods and madness by K. Redfield Jamison. This is a memoir about growing up with bipolar disorder, or as K. Redfield Jamison prefers to call it, manic depression. She herself is a psychologist who studies bipolar disorder, so she has kind of an interesting perspective on her own life suffering from it, and obviously on the illness itself. And I'm really liking it so far. It's really interesting hearing her sort of psychoanalyzing her younger self. Since she herself is a psychologist, she sort of has some, you know, grounds on which to do that. But yeah, it's just, I'm really enjoying it so far. It's really easy to read. And the two books I have ongoing, I'm not going to mention these in too many other videos, just since I'm sort of chipping away at both of them. We have The Divine Comedy by Dante. I finished The Inferno this month and have moved on to the Purgatorio. And then the Penguin Book of English Verse, which I'm still really enjoying. And then finally, I wanted to talk about some books I'm going to be reading. I'm going to be reading for buddy reads or read-alongs. So obviously we have The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, which is a read-along. The other read-along I'm hoping to participate in, again, we'll see if I can get to all of these, or I can get to this. These other two I will have to get to because they're buddy reads. But this next one I'm not entirely certain about, just because, again, I have a lot that I'm trying to shove into this 1 month. But it's Nothing to be Frightened of by Julian Barnes, which I'm hoping to read for Jason of Old Blues Chapter and Verse's Mortality Project. This is the book selection for this month for his Mortality Project, so hopefully I can get to that because it sounds very interesting. And then a buddy read with Britta Bowler. This is A History of... The Battle for God, A History of Fundamentalism by Karen Armstrong, which I'm super excited to read. I started to read it a few years ago, and I got about a third of the way through before I stopped reading, but I've meant to finish it ever since, so that'll be a lot of fun and super interesting. And then finally, the lone work of fiction on my TBR is Psalm 44 by Danilo Kis. Danilo Kis was a Serbo-Croat writer, and this novel was published sometime in the mid-20th century, but it's about a Jewish family during World War II who are shipped off to a concentration camp. I don't know if I said that I'm buddy reading this with Sean the Book Maniac. We both buddy read A Tomb for Boris Davidovich, which is also by Danilo Kis last year, and we both loved it, so we wanted to try out some more of his work. So anyway, that is all. I hope you all enjoyed. Give me your thoughts if you have you ever read any of these books or want to read any of these books. I hope you all have a very nice weekend, and I will talk to you all in my next video. Bye, guys.